I'd love to jump in here and talk about my favorite parent that came in. If you remember that one of my boy who is going into quite the lecture as to we don't do this. You need to teach them the multiplication tables. You need to have this process. And he was telling me that the thinking classrooms wasn't going to work because of the way that he had gone through school, and it was a foreign idea. And I find that is something where we do come up with some of these hiccups along the way, is that we have parents who were schooled a certain way and they've made it, they've done all right for themselves, they're okay. And now seeing that students are going through this whole new possibility with the thinking classroom and saying, well, this is not actually teaching.
I'm just looking at some of the comments here, kind of catching up with Katie. You can keep talking, you're doing good.
What did I miss? I apologize, my kids were.
So some of the comments here, we're just looking at figure out the role in learning, which is a tough role in grade 12. So an amazing year, but trying to figure out that role. I went and started when students didn't want to write on the board because it might be wrong. I stopped the entire class to ask them if we made mistakes in math, or if I made mistakes, they readily answered yes to this. So you start to see the value of the mistakes on the board. It's hard for students, only one teacher in the class to make the shift. Kids are still very much live in the world of studenting and their other classes, and then definitely in agreement. But these types of shifts should be happening in all the curriculum areas. And I love that one point because that's something I'm going to come back to later with what we're looking at here.
Okay. So the big thing that I found is that there's a reason I separated these kind of, this is what we wanted, but on the right. So students were given the choice, but they were still using us. Like my husband was saying, we strived for those interactions, and we knew that we wanted those interactions where we wanted to take back that role of being the facilitator instead of being the knowledge source. But the kids were making us hit that wall. So we felt that we needed this extra piece where students needed to take this reflection a little bit more to heart. So were they feeling pride in their work? Did they feel acknowledged for their learning? Did they have joy and happiness attached to their work? And did they see themselves actually in their spot in education? So taking control and taking charge of what they wanted to learn.
And this is sort of the questions, like, I mean, I'm to put in this part here, we'll sort of mention this at the start. It's a long framework. The first time I did this with my students, they did not understand what I was talking about. There was a lot of confusion. We had to do a lot of role modeling with them. So like, for example, this is something I started going through with myself, saying, okay, well, as a teacher, you know, why do I have pride in my work? Like, why do I love being a teacher? And this is where we share students things like, you know, I get to do different things every single day. I get to interact with all sorts of different people. I feel like my job is never dull. There's so many rewarding things that come from me being a teacher. It's my ties to supporting students and families, being a recognized figure within my community. The fact that being a teacher is what led me into something else that I really enjoy, such as coaching. And the fact that when I look at assessment, it allows me to kind of make some of those comments where I say, like, I see that growth and I see that progress in you. And that's something that makes me feel very special as an educator and as a human being, that I'm a part of that learning and journey. And that's something that gives me great joy and happiness, where I come to work every day and I love what I'm doing. And I love volunteering. I love showing up to basketball games and being involved in my own children and what they do in school. So it was sort of taking that time to kind of model this out and allow them to do different things. But of course, now saying, okay, how do we do different things? So like, for example, some of my students, we talked about using the white books, using mini whiteboards, for example. And again, practicing that skill where you may write something that's not right. You may have to have a messy learning, but take a mini whiteboard, or Whitebook sells those really cool workbooks, and just jot some ideas down about what you think about some of these questions. And we're going to come back and look at them again. And then allowed me to say, okay, how can we do some written sentences if you're strong at work, or really tie into like higher levels of learning. Some students, I was able to use this with conferencing. I would ask them the questions, they would tell me, and I would write down their answers. Some students I could give an iPad to, and I could just say, you know what, I want you to just say what you're feeling when you read this question. Do you want to do this by yourself? Do you want to do this with your groups and your partner? Or do you just want to have an opportunity to have like a reflective journal or a digital notepad or like one of these little whiteboards, and you just want to work by yourself and write some ideas down? But what I started to notice is after a lot of time, I would say it takes about a month of doing this once a week at least. You started to see some formulated ideas, and then you started to see changes. You know, some students may start off by saying, like, I like it for this reason, but I miss this. I'm not getting the point of it, and this is why. But that was, you know, not just them reflecting on what their values were to it. That also served as, I think, a community building activity for me as a teacher, because that given me all this wonderful feedback that the students maybe necessarily didn't realize they were giving me, that allowed me to go back and say, this is what I'm going to do different next time to help you with that. Or this is the question I'm going to ask you. Or I'll be honest, I'm going to be a little naughty with my random pairings. This is why I'm going to purposely put you with this student, because I think they're going to help you with that difficulty and problem.
I found that communication is the biggest thing that was an increase, because they needed to take that time to truly enunciate what they were feeling, what they were working with, and where they were struggling, and identify those components and put voice to it. And by having them up, the whiteboards, by having them on my windows, because I had a portable and I had beautiful windows where I had some kids that were considered high behavior needs. So it's like, sweet, you're on the windows, because it's naughty to draw on the windows. So it's the buy-in. It's that trying to find, and you all know your kids best, and you all make those relationships. So you know which of these pieces are going to be connecting for you. But I find that reflection piece is that extra push that helps them communicate clearer.
I just wanted to go back on the chat here really quick. I love the comment from Lisa here. I'm a history teacher, never taught a day of math in my life, but I love Liljedahl's Gradeless in my own practice. And then we started shouting out when anyone erased work, party foul. We
That's
caught
awesome.
on, and they caught erasing and joined the conversations.
I like that. I'm using that now.
We have a non-math teacher here for the curriculum. The party foul comment. Some of my students told me that they added the freedom. This is not real school. I had a student once tell me we need more drill and kill in the class.
And I still like to give that if that's what they're wanting. So like the thinking classrooms, we're looking for those student needs and everything that they want. So if they're asking for it, let's do that, and then bring into that whole thinking and critical thinking piece of it afterwards, saying, okay, well, how did that work for you? Can you share your thoughts in that? Can you explain to maybe somebody else or the whole group, depending on if they're introverted or extroverted even?
Well, and I like what you're saying there, Catherine, because it really ties into some of your comments before. I wanted to add that a lot of this allows us to really personalize students. Like, for example, when we talk about thinking classroom, students who want to sit on a ledge and write on the window versus using a white book or the whiteboard. Or, you know, I have students who they want to do this, but they set up their erasable surface at a desk. Is that it allows them to specialize themselves. This is the type of learner I am. Like, I'm kinesthetic. I like to move. I like to be up and jumping and bouncing, or this is how I feel better. Like, this really helped us get the students to sort of personify that. Like, do you get this? What type of learner you are? How do you learn best, and what your strategies are to support you? It also allowed us to really kind of connect to this idea that I'm trying to think how I want to say this here. Yes, I'm sorry. I saw something really captivating on the screen and it got me thinking right there. But it also allowed us to kind of connect to this idea of what do you want from your math class? This is something I struggle with as a teacher. Like, I like the thinking classroom model, but I think as I've been doing this and sort of developing myself under this sort of practice and other things I do as a teacher, is respecting student autonomy. Do students say they want drill and kill? Okay, I get that. You may prefer drill and kill. You may like this idea of, I just want to memorize my times tables and do the algorithm. I got it, I get the answer. Can you tell me why? Why is that important to you? Why is that going to help you? Why does that make you like feel good about yourself as a mathematician? And it's sort of getting to that point where, you know, I know deep down with my own practice, it may not be what I want, but maybe trying to take a deep breath and say that if the student understands what they're doing, they're able to know what they're doing, and they know why they're doing it, then that's really what the most important piece is.
We got to fully remove ourselves from our ego sometimes too. I know there's, I've gone through some lessons where I've planned out giving the presentation of the activity to start off, and was going to have them all working through their thinking classroom and interacting. And because they'd had a massive test in one of their other courses the day before, it fell flat because they were mentally drained. So it's really coming back to that knowing your students too.
And the nice thing about this is it really tied in together about, I think, that bigger piece we were talking about when we look at assessment. So when we were looking at our curriculum, when we started doing this, my wife and I started saying, let's start hitting multiple outcomes. Our district wants us to do social and emotional learning with our students. We've got this here because we're getting them to do some of those activities here, connecting to themselves, why they do things, why does it matter? I found personally in my class, this tied into my mindfulness. We do some of these activities. I maybe let them have recess when I was teaching elementary, or maybe after lunch with a junior high group. I let them come back. I put on 20 minutes of relaxing music, and I just asked them to write, what are you thinking about this? What's going on in your brain? As a general teacher, we had English. So a lot of these outcomes I was doing, I was able to say, this is going to tie into my language arts. So I'm getting rid of these outcomes at the same time too. And then I was able to jump into my communication, my collaborative. So it was allowing me to do one activity, but then sort of get really excited with the kids. We're hitting multiple teaks and outcomes with this. So we're doing our language arts, we're doing our creativity and critical thinking, we're communicating, we're touching upon our personal and social, we're doing some fun mindfulness activities, we're doing our social and emotional learning, and you're learning a larger set of skills, where I have appreciation to the earlier comment, that you don't have to be a math teacher to do this. If you're a history teacher, like, these skills will help you in history. And that's sort of where I had a colleague in Alberta who taught high school, was saying, I love what you're sharing with me, Jared, when I met up with him during the summer, but I just teach math. Like, this is not going to fit my math class. And it allowed me to say that you need to find one of your friends or colleagues who is in English, who teaches the same kids, and you guys got to find a way to be collaborative with this. I'm just trying to catch up on the chat here before I go on. We have to push them beyond the why of drill and kill. Drill and kill feels safe for students who are good at the task. Thinking tasks can be scary for our stronger students
And
who
they're
like to
easy
follow an
marks.
algorithm and get a correct solution on the first try. And that's going to be where we're going next.
They're easy marks for drill and kill too.
I like what Will said here. Curious to what people here make of the following statement. I don't care what you think, I care how you think. I think we got to touch upon that before we go too further. I totally agree with that, Sherry. Thinking is much harder because it's not a linear path. As an instructional coach, I love that thought. I can imagine teachers would be frustrated with that sometimes. The pressure to hit the content targets is great. And then a wonderful statement allows for negative cognitive feedback rather than a strictly algorithmic feedback.
I want to touch back on that question that was put out into the chat about it's not what you think, it's about how you think. It mirrors something to what I would literally jump up and down in my class. It's not about the answer, it's about the process. And my kids, they wrote out a 12 Days of Christmas of Miss Hamilton's common phrases, and that made it into there. So like, and it's true. It's really comes down to shifting that mindset from, I just got the right answer. I got the right answer. I got the right answer. Well, how did you get the right answer? What process did you use? Oh, because that person actually over there, they approach this problem in a totally different manner.
And I like some of the things, I like this comment that Will just said here that I'm going to be coming into, where we talk about the journey. This is something a student of mine said. It's a quote. I use it. I cite them. He said, any answer that you can find with Google is not worth my time in school. And that was his commentary when we were talking about like calculator calculations and anything like that. If you're asking me a question that I can pull out my smartphone and get the answer, then we don't need you anymore, Mr. Hamilton, or any teacher is sort of what he was saying. Teachers are now redundant because Google will teach me anything I need to know. I just need to work through the worksheets. And it's just this idea that exactly like this is the important part, that we focus on education, that we're here to support your learning and mentor some of your decisions and your ideas, that we're here to identify mistakes and help you cope with the emotions you go through with those mistakes, and then help you move past them. So before we move on, the activity that I wanted to do, because I find sometimes, this isn't the first time we've done something like this, but it sometimes helps with the process. If I were to just ask you all in the chat to look at one of those questions on the screen, would you mind just typing in an answer with respect to, I mean, anything, your job? I would put towards the thinking classroom model, but like, do teachers, as a teacher, do you feel pride in your work? Do you feel acknowledged for your contributions as a teacher? Do you see yourself in the classroom that you teach? Do you have joy and happiness in what you do?
I find making that emotional connection also a big component to having the recall for students, even for us as individuals. I like to do a lot of psychological reading because it's just fascinating for me with how students learn and how we learn and what we make connection to. And one of the readings I had to do, I'm currently doing my professional master's right now. And on the course that I was just completing, we were talking about the importance of these ill-structured dialogues. So these difficult conversations that don't fit into that nice bubble. And they don't have that answer. So how do we bring that out in this world? And I find that when we're dealing with these emotional connections, we're allowed to kind of build on it and get the kids speaking to it.
So part of the reason I do this here, because I think it's a nice little model, is like looking at the chat. I know this is remote learning. It's a Sunday night. We have other things going on, which I think ties into it too. But I do notice at first, what I'm seeing now is like small answers. One person kind of responded. That's atypical of what I feel you will see the very first time you do something like this with your students. It's not a safe environment. It's not something they understand what you're asking to do. They're struggling to find out why they're being marked on it. Sometimes they just need a lot of thinking time. You know, like how do you look at it and you think, okay, there's been a 5 minute silence, and I get in the situation where I want to jump into a lesson or rescue them, but it kind of has that part where you have to look at your students and realize their brains are moving. They're just not there yet, which of course is something I'm noticing in the chat now. There feels like there's a lot more answers that are coming up. So it's that idea of front loading the patience into something like this, where you know, these are questions that I feel are really important to ask them, to kind of connect to that why we do this and why it matters, but also understanding that it's not something the students have seen before. They need a moment to wrap their head around the questions. And I think it's trying to avoid, you know, like, you know, your students. I mean, I try to avoid giving exemplars because again, I don't want them copying what I'm doing, but just given enough time and patience for them to get involved and get messy with this. And then as the teacher, like a thinking classroom, we start coming in with that feedback and those compliments about yes, yes, yes. Now what do we do else? Where do we go next with this? And sort of feeding that culture where they start doing this more and more and more.
And I find we really need those compliments lots and lots, because it's part of that safe space where it makes that security, saying like, I love this, great question. And it's something so small, but I find even with my new students now, there's some negative talk that you can tell that they feel embarrassed, and you don't want that, right?
And that's the big spin-off that I get from this when I put it directly into a thinking classroom model, is that I find my students doing this, they become more secure with the process. They become more willing to accept mistakes and moments of messy thinking. And they become better at expressing their answers. They become better at asking questions and inquiry. Like it feeds into all those little skills in this model that we want to develop more with the students to help them be stronger and successful as mathematicians and thinkers.
I'll be in my classroom and I'll be working through a problem, and I will have legitimately made a mistake because I'm either the coffee hasn't kicked in yet, or there's been something else going on that threw off something, and I'm going up and I'm trying to resume, and I've legitimately made a mistake. And when they mention it, we're going, oh, but oh, silly me. And it's that demonstration that it's okay that we make mistakes. We make them all the time. We're adults and we make mistakes. You're kids, you make mistakes. You're in a safe environment. You can make those mistakes. What are you taking away from it? Where are you going to go with it now?
Yeah, I'm just kind of getting caught up on the comments here as Catherine's speaking there. I just want to do a quick summary of some of the things here. So the idea of, finding the joy and value, making sure students feel valued in the work and the contributions they're making.
And that value is going to lead to autonomy.
How this ties into a lot of different careers. I know I saw that problem with the COVID situation not helpful. My wife and I found when we were doing remote learning last year at this time, my wife, especially when she was working with her classrooms, she found these reflective class activities were amazing for COVID because it allowed the students to sort of stop. Give or take, we had already developed this culture with them, but it allowed them to sort of show up to these Zoom meetings we had, feel safe, and just talk. It was something that I think we really needed back in the spring when this first started, and just share what was going on, what were things that were making them happy, if they were feeling sort of an emotional need. Well, let's tie back to this. What did we learn? How can we experience joy? What's something we could do that would make us feel happy again? I'm just looking here later on. Teachers want to be acknowledged and valued. Students need to be valued as well. Yes. Having students seeing themselves and finding meaning in their lives. Will, I like your comment there about why non-curricular tasks are so so important at the beginning. Pride in the work, which is one of my favorite parts, but getting them exactly to see that idea that, take pride in your mistakes, take pride in your successes, take pride in everything that you do. I have noticed that the more feedback I give on assessments out grades, the less students ask me about grades, baby steps. And this sort of ties into the bigger part we're going to be going next about how we use this within a gradeless format. One of the big things that I've found is really successful when I get into doing a gradeless classroom is just that idea of the best way to start a gradeless classroom is to just start grading less. Give the students back less and less marks. Focus more on the processes and times for learning.
Is that the next slide? It is.
And then, of course, getting them to sort of take this shift to, when you think about what we looked at between a student and a teacher about what we learned, you didn't get a test and you didn't get a whole bunch of check marks. You didn't get like multiple choice answers you could go back and look at. I didn't explain to you how you should have answered the question. The majority of the time we focused on was, what did you feel about this? What was your big takeaway? What was the part you did of this that you were most proud of? Do you recognize that you were appreciated for this work? Like, how did you know that Mr. Hamilton was just like going crazy in his mind as he was watching you work through these mathematical outcomes? What do your parents speak to you about when you come home with some of these things? What do your classmates tell you when you get a really good idea? And even just that whole part of, so where are we going with this? Like, how do you see this helping you in the future? Do you see a career? Is this your gateway into university? Like, maybe you're not going to be a mathematician, but you recognize this is going to help you do the other things you want to do. For some of my older students, we're writing our resumes. We're putting our CVs together for the very first time. How would you use some of this language to convince an employer or a special program, volunteering, anything like that, to hire you for the very first time. So we got a couple of things that we did and we worked on here within the idea of the Gradeless framework. Myself personally, I'm really big on the idea of doing portfolios. This would be the idea of students writing down some of their messy work, writing down some of their big aha moments, and then having this part in there where they keep writing about their reflective process and what they do. I was able to use multiple formats for this. So students, based on their learning needs or their preference, would you want to be doing a written journal? Do you want this to be a verbal journal? I had one student, it was actually really cool. She made a comic book that talked about her reflections. I used it in conferences and interviews. So if I felt that I had students who were struggling with this, they needed a little more guidance or they needed a scribe, I was able to do that. And then it's tied into sort of the multiple forms of evidence part. You know, I mean, I saw it as sort of a connection to students who were struggling and they needed that last part. This gave me some evidence that I could use to help them or say where they were and where we would go next. The risky part that I used it in, because I've had some success and some failure with it, is how do you work with those students who are getting straight A's and you realize they have no connection to this whatsoever?
They can reproduce the content.
They can reproduce the content. They can write any single test. They're buying the strategy books. They're flying through anything you could possibly give them. But now how do you come back and say, do you really understand this? Do you care about it? So this sort of gave me some ideas to come back and say, but how do we get that piece? How is it missing? Is it important? Why should we have it? And I'm just jumping to the chat really quick here.
So the biggest way that I've kind of adapted this to, or in the process of adapting this to, is a lot of the students that I've had are used to having absolutely every piece of paper that they touch graded. And I had some of them taken aback when I said, no, I'm not grading that. We're working through this because we're learning the process. This is the time for formative. This is the time for discussion. This is the time to find out where we're strong and find out where we're lacking a little bit. And so there was some kickback originally with that because they're not used to it. So you persevere and you try again, and eventually that they do work through it and they get the idea that no, you're actually helping me more because you're giving me that feedback. It's not an official grade, it's not an official mark, but we're discussing this idea of where I'm strong and where I'm weak. And then I'm hoping to be able to even amp it up to that next level where they start having those conversations, not just with me anymore, but with each other. And so that they're looking at each other's work and being able to say, well, no, I think you're struggling over here. Like, do you know your fraction rules kind of idea as a random topic?
And I'm just looking at the chat here really quick. I wanted to summarize some of the comments that I was looking at here. Starting kind of here, postponing grades as long as possible. Definitely. And this is sort of what we try to take advantage of in this part, is that we just stop talking about grades. We start changing the work from where they're getting less and less of actual work, where they would see a percentage or a bunch of check marks. And we start getting into this idea of the conversation piece. There was a really cool commentary I saw by Paula about having students make a Google site. We've done lots of things like this. Platforms such as Nearpod, Shobi work really good for this too.
Jamboard can be fun too.
Jamboard can be a lot of fun. I found this just as easy as getting the students, if they're like based on what their technology comfort is, just making a Google slide deck and just adding slides, but getting them to see that timeline where you can say, look at where we are and look at where we're going. Sorry, where we are, where we were, where we are now, and where we're possibly going. And again, coming back to these questions, how are these going to help us along that journey as we explore our mathematical thinking or any type of thinking? Let's take a look here at the next part. We did portfolios and pre-calc this year. Many students refer back to calculus and commented on that. We see the comment on assessing portfolios. That one I find, from my experience, It really depends on the students and their comfort level. Some students I've offered some sort of comments and feedback, such as my responses to theirs. Others I've left portfolios as their personal books, their messy work that I would only look at if they gave me permission to look at them. But I think it's this part right here where we talk about, like building the culture that I'm seeing here, that this is sort of something my wife and I look at when we talk about this in the background.
We talk lots too, by the way.
That we see this as sort of slow change. Like we want quicker, we want this to be in our curriculum, but we also look at this and say, the parents that we talk to today were products of the system we know before. And this is where we have, I think, some of these miscommunications that we try to work with them as well. And that's why I like portfolios, is because I find sometimes as a teacher, I speak to them about this, they don't get it. But by the time I have that second conference and I have that portfolio, it's like flicking a light switch. The mindset is completely different when you see that evidence that we have there. But we also think in our minds that these are the students who are becoming the future parents. So if we can hit them with this and we can give them those elements of choice, then maybe, 5 years, 10 years down the road, when we start thinking about, could we do this differently? This is the parent group that my wife and I think we're going to be speaking with, who are going to have that difference in that comparison. And because we're building all these positive emotions to what we did, this is what we're hoping to connect with when we say it is time for a change. We need to rewrite some of these assessment laws. We need to be looking at some of these things. This is why we want to do it. And now we need to start talking about how we're going to do it.
And those my dream in the end would be that with these positive connections, is that we're not being faced with so many of these kids that go through and they hate school, or they are finding the negative side of their lives overwhelming, and maybe combat that mental health piece too that we've got going in the background. I apologize for our children if you hear them in the background.
We're two young Canadians in Texas right now. We're just starting to build community branches. So sadly, we don't have childcare or anything like that.
No, not yet.
And we have a very young family, 3 children, 2 of them are 5 and under.
So close to being out of daycare though, so close.
And I like some of the comments we're getting here about like assessing the portfolios and using that as evidence of learning, letting the students use the portfolios to determine their own grade. And again, this is why I like these reflective questions, because it helps them connect to that. And even being able to speak with administration. The best exemplars that I find with these is that when you do this and you build one of these and you now need to go see your admin, it's the same thing. I've had admins who look at this sometimes, they stare at me like, okay, I'm not getting you, Jared. I'm not following, but we still need to do all these assessments. We got to get through these tests. But when these portfolios start coming out and they start seeing that messy learning, the two-way feedback, I write the student a comment, they respond back to me. The students have like Post-it notes in them where they're making corrections, or like I give them overhead projections where they put that in on the sheet and then they write their correction on top so they see the original work. You start seeing like the light bulbs going off like crazy about, how do we do this? How do we get more of this? You do this in math. Would this work in history? Like, could a student have a learning portfolio in history that would show all these things? Could students in science have evidence of this? And then you start seeing what I like is that building of culture where the students all start buying in really well, or better than before, and parents as well, because we're all doing it. This is happening in any class they do.
And the student-led parent-teacher interviews. So where the kids are coming out and saying, you know what, this is what I've done. So it's less the parents talking with the teacher and more engaging with their own child in their child's learning.
And that was that one time where we gave them the Post-it notes and said, write comments for yourself, write things you want to talk about. So when you're with mom and dad and you feel like you're going to freeze, kind of like a public speaking strategy, look at your Post-it notes. What did you want to talk about? Remind yourself.
Your crib notes. Ready to go next one?
Yes, please. Yeah. So this is sort of how we see it in the process right here. This flip sort of flow chart that Katherine made that she's going to be discussing with us.
Really, when we're looking at, like, this includes kind of like the start of our thinking classroom activity where you start with a question, then you move into the thinking classroom, you reflect on it afterwards mathematically, and then you're taking it back personally and reflecting on how you feel and really connecting into those emotions, as well as our reflections on the process. And like you see all the arrows, because I find each one of these steps in our whole cycle of this kind of a lesson or this kind of activity, it all leads to autonomy, because in the end, it's you giving them that opportunity again and again and again. And it's through that repetitive autonomy that they're seeing that, yes, they're being successful in moments, they're seeing themselves fail in moments, and that it's okay. Coming back to that previous point that we talked about with mistakes. And the more we go through this process again and again, the more comfortable they will be in taking the reins away from you. But it does take time.
I just wanted to look at some of the comments here to sort of discuss about right here. It was sort of this idea of working with portfolio buildings and portfolio building and assessment.
Do we go back?
My wife and I perfectly agree with this. This is something we struggled with too. This is sort of where we started building the need of the gradeless assessment, where we started looking at, well, how much do we really need to assess? Where do we jump in? Like, we're both mathematicians, we know our curriculum. So can we start looking at outcomes where I could conclude, okay, for example, trigonometry is a great way of looking at it. Maybe I have to teach students ratio, and then I have to teach them trigonometry. Maybe I did a little bit of the ratio work with them, and I got a rough idea that they do understand how to manipulate a ratio or what one is. And then I got into trigonometry, and then I started to notice some of them were flying with it, but some of them didn't understand substitution. Some of them couldn't manipulate a ratio. So it wasn't enough just saying, okay, well, you didn't understand trigonometry. There's these fundamental skills. So I would jump back to that in their portfolio. So I would try and group some outcomes together to say, I don't need to look at these 4 outcomes because I know I'm going to do this with you. This could just be some quick formative assessment. If I get the summative on this, I know I have these skills. But it's also about this idea that when they start getting more involved in this, it was less work for me to be looking at because they started presenting their struggles to me. So again, like me using Post-its or tabbies and asking them, you tell me where I need to be looking in your portfolio so I know when to jump into those parts.
And it's also really, really cool to see when it's like going back to any work that you maybe have kept as a kid, from going back to when you were in grade 1 and looking back and saying, oh my goodness, like look at my writing back then. It while it's not as vast as that because it's contained to your course that you're dealing with those students, but having that beginner piece and that ending piece and saying, look at the journey that you have gone through. Look at this process. You sucked over here, but you're sailing through this now.
And that's something I wanted to bring into the part here that Catherine said. We had one year where I commented on this when I taught in England. We had a very drill and kill regime. You take notes, you do practice problems, you write quizzes. We're getting you ready for that GCSE. When that year was done, every single student I worked with threw their notebooks in the garbage. Not one student in my classroom took that notebook home. They were done, they wrote their tests, they were waiting for their marks, they all went in the recycle bin. When we first started portfolios, Catherine shared with me in her math exam, out of 25 kids, 23 of them said, can we keep these and take them home? And that to me was like, that was like one of the most powerful pieces of this for me as an educator, that you made a product with them that they insisted that they had to keep and make it a part of their personal lives, or at least it had to go home and have an extra step before wherever they did with it next. I did see a comment here on assessment I wanted to speak about here. Yes, I do use the student reflections as part of their assessment. If I can find curricular outcomes that I can tie them to, I make it a part of it. But that being said too, I've also used them in gradeless learning where I wasn't assigning a grade, where this just became something that accompanied their learning. So again, kind of going through the flow path where we use it here. We use this as the inquiry and proposed question at the start. We go through our thinking classroom activity. We do the mathematical analysis and reflection. We do their personal reflections. This part here is where we look a lot of these questions that we wrote on the previous slide. We were talking about resource sharing before. Thank you so much, Will. Catherine and I will have something that we can share, a few guided practice activities. And of course, they will be shared as an editable format, so that if you need to sort of change them to fit your student needs, please do. But then we hit this last piece, which is the teacher reflection, where when we start seeing this, we start looking and thinking, okay, what do we need to change? What would we do different next time? How do we support our students based on what they're sharing with us? And it really, I think for me as a teacher, was an eye opener to what my students were thinking about the lessons and what they were getting away from. Something I'm actually quite appreciative of now that we're teaching in Texas. And I've learned at the end of the year, my students are going to evaluate me.
Yes.
Where I'm already kind of smiling with Catherine, where I've done a little bit of this here and there in our lessons to say it's given me sort of a nice snapshot of what I'm expecting to hear at the end of the year.
Mhm. And it comes down to that emotional connection for you as well as a teacher, because the more passion and drive that you're bringing in and excitement there, it's infectious. It really is. And the more they see it, you feed off them. It's a give and take, where they take on the excitement and then you take on the excitement, and it just snowballs, which we hopefully will never see again.
I like the comment here, Carmen, that you made about using portfolios and grade lists. The grades gives me the freedom of using the portfolios as evidence. I'm not struggle to mark. Absolutely. I think Will, would you right? I think this came up in a light reader in your session, Carmen. We'll go to look there. So yeah, I mean, I think my closing remark here before we look at the next slide, and I'd love to do some feedback and questions back and forth. I think something that I came across recently in medical sort of diagnosis that's really sort of invoked me to look into this more is we were looking at treatments of how we deal with obesity, and how a lot of medical science journals are starting to say now this idea of drill diets and exercise regimes, we're not solving the problem. Like the problem is growing, it's becoming worse. And they were trying to hit this idea of now, especially in Canada, I'm not too sure about the States, I haven't got that far in my research, that maybe this is an emotional and psychological problem. And maybe that's how we have to start treating it. You know, maybe the best way to help people with weight loss or body image is to find out why you're not happy and why this is happening, or what's going on in your life. And that's something that really got me thinking about this part here when I was speaking to Catherine a few weeks ago is, you know, we think about this drill kill practice and we're going to get these high grades and we're going to get the standardized testing. And yet I noticed in my own experience, it doesn't seem like a lot of folks enjoy math who I speak to out of the classroom.
I teach geometry right now, and anytime anybody asks me what I do, they say, why would you teach that course?
Well, I joke sometimes, what do you do for a living, Jared? I say art teacher until they get to know me better. And then I come out of the closet and admit that I'm a math teacher just to avoid any negative emotions. But this idea again, that maybe this is the real part we need to focus on, is that emotional piece. And this is how we can come back and fix some of these problems that are going on. So we wanted to leave this as a final thought on our slide before we get into some questions and answers.
Come on. Frozen.
Okay.
Touching it. I'm touching it.
Let me try. I'm gonna do this.
Yep.
Okay. Yes,
Right there.
right there, and we'll go preset. So these are some things that we've been hearing about from other colleagues about where they've been taking this when we shared this with them. These are thoughts that I keep looking at and thinking about myself too in my own practice. Teachers who have built this into their project-based learning, making this a part of the module. Teachers who have used this exclusively for social and emotional learning. I've had other teachers say this ties in perfectly to formative and summative teaching, where they would be doing traditionally what they would do in the classroom, but bringing it back one more time. And then that piece I had from my colleague in Alberta, who says he built a whole foundation of team teaching from this, where he started having weekly meetings with the 5 teachers who taught the same grade 11 students and saying, what are we all doing with them? what are skills, like the big skills, the soft skills we all have to start developing with them, and how can we work together? How can we get evidence that we can all share in terms of assessment? So like, for example, my friend Shane, he'll do these written activities in mathematics. He'll pass them on to his teacher who teaches English, and she'll use them as evidence of writing assessment, building their ideas, changing their narratives, looking at their spelling and grammar, and then she'll use that as an evidence in a mark. Some of the values about where do we go next, how does this tie in together? He's working with his science colleagues, saying that the students are starting to really connect to some of the mathematical principles we do and how we use them in science and why they're so important. And I like the one comment that he said, our friend Abigail, who teaches social studies in Canada, made, was this idea that we're learning all these things on Canadian history. Why? Why is this important? Why are we learning about World War II? Why are we going back 50 years and looking at all this stuff? Like, why does this actually matter in my life? And getting students to make those connections, which she's starting to say, she's noticing is a lot more successful in getting them to pick up on these ideas and remember these timelines and be able to write about this on their exams or their papers, or just in general. Like, I want you to go research a topic, a time in history, and talk about it to me. I'm trying to think one quote she said. One student said to her, we say history is written from the perspective of the winners. And that's why we're doing all these talks now, where we're starting to learn about maybe some things we've done in the past that we shouldn't be as proud of. She says, but if we never heard the perspective from the people who lost, how do we evaluate what they're telling us? And she was just like mind blown off that with the answer. I'm trying to think how she says, well, she swore, but she was like, I have no idea. And I think she used like a swear word in there or something like that. I can't remember how she said it to me, but she was just like, this is what I want in my history lessons. They're talking, they're sharing ideas. They're wanting to learn more. They're wanting to read and get multiple perspectives. Will, thank you. I really appreciate the comment that you were making there. Schooling and bringing in the idea of, the new to learn humanity is a transactional with the currency of grades. One thing Thinking Classroom does very well, in my opinion, is to rebuild a culture that places humans and their interactions at the core of the experience. And that's really what we're trying to build here when we look at these 5 questions. How do we make this about them? This curriculum is about you.
I've passed. I've done this. I've got my job. I'm making my money because I've gone through this already. Now this is about your step, your journey, and your path to success.
Mm-hmm. And on a personal level, I think for me, what I love about this the most is that this allows me to hit home every single day when students speak to me. Why do I teach? I've had lots of students say to me in my career, well, Mr. Hamilton, you have 3 degrees. You have 2 professional masters. You're about to get a PhD. I talked to you with my dad, and my dad says you're nuts for being a teacher. You could make like $100,000 in a different profession. So why do you teach? And then this is the framework when I speak to them about why I still do this job, why I've done it for over a decade, and why I still plan to be doing it 20 years from now. At this point, I think we're good, Catherine. Can we open up like some questions we have, comments, anything like that within the chat? I don't know if anyone would like to just use the chat or if they want to take off their microphone and speak.
Let me take off the share screen maybe?
Yeah, it should be all right. So again, we do have some exemplars and resources. We are going to share those with Will so that they can go out to anyone who would like to use them. Again, I make that comment that, like Thinking Classrooms, this is going to be a painful experience at the beginning. It's going to take the students a while to adapt to the formula and understand what they're supposed to be doing. But just like a Thinking Classroom, when you front load it and you build all those skills and you give them time to do this, and more importantly, if you can get your department on board, so that idea that I think in my mind, if the grade 6s are seeing it and I teach grade 7, that is a huge step for me. And then if the grade 8s are doing this, they keep getting it. That just really builds into that culture of what we're trying to do here. Lots of thank yous. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a lot of thank you. So I'll extend one as well. Thank you, Hamiltons, for doing this. People with 3 young children should not give up an otherwise perfectly serviceable Sunday night to share with us. But
it's adult time.
Yeah.
kind of.
You know, as always, these are as casual and as rich as I hope they are, and this was no exception. So I'm very glad that you were willing to do this.
And we want to say thank you to having us on it and having us have the opportunity to be able to kind of just share our experiences and have you partake with either the chat or just even just being there and participating at the level that you want, right? It's all about what we want to drive, right?
Yes, I completely agree. So maybe if you are new to Thinking Classroom and this is all seeming like there were a lot of threads pulled together, and I think if you're uninitiated, you won't exactly notice how many threads there were there, but if you're familiar, you'll start to see. So I hope it came at least across that it's a pretty sharing group, a pretty eager and happy group. So if you are new to this and you are feeling a little bit like you need to reach out, I don't think there's a single person here who wouldn't be welcome to receive that email. So thank you so much for doing this.
Perfect, thank you.